But from 64 to 68, it was like a seed underground, right? But nothing sprouted.
And then in 68,
right. So
tragedy struck.
Right. So on Sunday, March 30th, 1968, I had just been named by my neighborhood caucus to be a member of a slate of delegates, would-be delegates, who were going to run to be elected to represent the District of Columbia at the Chicago Convention of the Democratic Party, which of course didn't happen until the summer. But March 30th, that's what I just become, because our delegation was called Democrats for Peace and Progress. It was anti-racist, anti-war, and for some kind of recognition of DC's right to vote somehow.
To have a representative,
right.
Yeah.
Maybe even statehood for DC. So that's Sunday afternoon, and that Sunday afternoon is when Lyndon Johnson went on television, and we all expected him to announce another big increase in the troops in Vietnam, and instead he said, I'm finished, I'm not going to run for president, and I'm sending Averell Harriman to Paris to negotiate with the Vietnamese government, which up to that moment we had pretended didn't exist. Okay, so then and we all
pretty dramatic
went from all over the city without even any planning. People went to sing and dance at Lafayette Park across the street from the White House. Okay, for 5 days, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and half of Thursday, there's an era of good feeling in American society. And then Thursday afternoon, evening, Dr. King is murdered.
Yeah.
And the next day, Black Washington and Black everywhere basically blows up.
Erupts. Right? And we had several years of, I mean, it had begun in 64 in Watts. We had race riots, to go back to your term, from 1919.
Right.
But then it continued every summer in the late 60s in different cities.
So in 68, there was a group of us who knew, we could taste it on the streets, there was going to be a Black uprising in, we assume, July or August. That's when it always happened. And instead, of course, it happened on April 5th.
Right after King's death.
That's right, the day after King's death. And the president, Lyndon Johnson, sent the army to occupy the city of Washington, and they really occupied it. Schools, the traffic circles, all that, right? They were there. And he imposed a curfew, which in theory applied to everybody in the city, but the cops didn't care if white folks were on the streets.
Right.
There were several thousand Blacks arrested, with the only charge being they violated the curfew. So we put together a network of white civil rights and anti-war activists who could be on the streets, and we used that privilege to get food and medical supplies and doctors and lawyers into the Black community, which otherwise would totally cut off with the curfew. And that's what I was doing for a week. 1 week after King was killed, came the first night of Passover.
Right.
And I, as was my custom, walked home to get ready for the Seder. But that meant walking past the army. And there was a Jeep with a machine gun pointed at the block in downtown Washington that I lived on.
Right. And you and your family lived there, right?
Yes.
By this point, you have...
Yeah. By 68, two children,
two
a wife
children.
and 2 children. Yeah. Little ones. Right. So my kishkas, my innards, more than my brain, begins to say, this is Pharaoh's army. Right. You're going home to celebrate the Seder, the liberation from Pharaoh. And this is Pharaoh's army
right
on the
here
street.
On the street. Yeah.
Right. So the Seder turned into not just something serious, which it had been for me, but explosive. Like discovering right out there's a volcano I didn't even know existed. It's inside me, this volcano.
Right.
And I was A, blown away, and B, blown away by being blown away. What is going on, Waskow? So
So here you really saw the power inherent in religious symbols and religious myth in the drama.
And this line in the Haggadah, which I had read every year since I knew how to read, in every generation, every human being is obligated to look upon himself, herself, as if we go forth from slavery to freedom, not just our great grandmommies and daddies. Right. So suddenly, that's real.
It was real.
Totally real.
It is real.
So
it remains real.
Right. So then I go off as a delegate. We won, right? Our slate won in D.C. We were committed to Robert Kennedy, and then Kennedy gets killed, and I drew on my hat as historian. I remembered that in many national party conventions, when a delegation from some state wasn't sure who to support for president, they would nominate what they called a favorite son. There was never a favorite daughter, but they would nominate a favorite son from their own state, somebody they were honoring, to hold a place while they made up their minds what they were going to do.
Right.
So I proposed that we nominate the chair of our delegation, who was a young black minister, kind of young version of King. He was not only anti-racist, he was anti-war, he was a total mensch. And
his name?
Channing Phillips, Reverend Channing Phillips. So we did, and we nominated him. He got not only the D.C. votes, but scattered votes from previous Kennedy supporters. And the convention, of course, was a total disaster. I mean, people inside the convention were getting beat up by Mayor Daley's sergeants in arms. People outside the convention were getting beat up or worse by Daley's police force in Chicago. And I left the convention thinking that my imagining of being a sort of left liberal Democrat, my imagining of being an effective, world-changing, independent scholar, activist, all gone.
It was
the only thing
incredibly disillusioned.
Yeah, and the only thing left inside me was this Jewish piece and the Seder. So I spent the fall of '68 driven to write what became the Freedom Seder, in which I wove passages about Black liberation in America together with the ancient story of liberation from Pharaoh.
Now, a lot of people are used to homemade Haggadahs now and used to that kind of contemporizing, but at the time, there was nothing like it.
Right. I mean, one of the unexpected, effective things I did in my life, unexpectedly, was seeding the whole idea that you could liberate the Haggadah and write your own. And in fact, what happened that fall, as I was writing it, and when I said driven, I had written 3 books by then, but this one felt like it was writing me. I wasn't writing it.
Right.
And I was absolutely driven. And I would write a paragraph and then call up one of my friends and read the paragraph. I'd never done that before. And half my friends said, Waskow, that is amazing. That's wonderful. And the other half said, you can't do that.
What are you playing with religion for?
Yeah. And they said, there is a Haggadah. There's no, you can't write a Haggadah. It's written already. It exists already. So I decided when I finished what I figured was the first draft, I figured I better ask some serious, knowledgeable Jew whether I'm just crazy to do this or it's useful. And I asked around and got the name of a young rabbi in Washington, Harold White, who I learned was against the Vietnam War and had done some civil rights work because it didn't make sense to ask anybody else. And I called him up and I explained what I was doing and said, I would like his frank opinion, whether this was crazy or not. He said, well, it sounds interesting. Send it to me. So I did. So weeks later, he calls me up and says, Waskow, I love it. It's such an activist midrash on the Haggadah. I wonder whether you know the ancient rabbis had their activist midrash they said God wouldn't split the Red Sea until an activist walked in up to his nose on the verge of drowning. Only then would God respond to an activist and split the sea.
So was this your introduction to the term midrash?
I said to him, "What's a midrash?"
Yeah, I can imagine.
And he, instead of saying, "So who needs to talk to an ignoramus and amaretz like you?" he said, "Oh, let me share the midrash with you." And he sent me a wonderful collection of really exciting midrash by Nachum Glatzer, who edited it. And I fell in love with the whole crazy idea that you could take a 3,000-year-old text and give it a twirl, and it would come out somewhere new.
Well, I'm convinced that what you did with the Seder was not really new, because in the Seder we say, somebody who hasn't fulfilled these minimum things hasn't fulfilled the Seder, which means that at one point it was very extemporaneous.
Right.
And these were the minimum guidelines. And then what we ended up with was, some kind of maximum, but or some skeleton of what had happened. But it's all about the conversation. And you prompted these new conversations.
Right.
So
I didn't know that it wasn't new. I mean, like the story of Akiba and the Seder he leads clearly was plopped into the Haggadah after the original Haggadah, because they were doing midrash on their own.
And they were thinking they were plotting against the Romans. And that's what we now think mostly about that paragraph in the Haggadah. So then it came out, and how did your life change? And how long, it initiated a period of change, and we're now 48 years later, right? Or it got published, you celebrated it, you celebrated the first one where?
So what happened was Ramparts magazine, a kind of the nearest equivalent now is maybe Mother Jones, published this. And it was almost by accident. The editors of Ramparts magazine came to Washington to meet with Mark Raskin at the Institute for Policy Studies to ask for help raising money. And as they were about to leave, they said, "Oh, by the way, is anybody here writing anything that would be interesting to publish in the magazine?" And Marcus says, "Well, Waskow's writing this weird thing, a radical version of the Haggadah." And they said, "That's perfect, that's wonderful." So they published it. And there was an organization in Washington, which I knew nothing about, called Jews for Urban Justice, which were Jews in their 20s, maybe early 30s, but mostly in their 20s. And they came to me and said, "Well, it's all well and good to write Haggadah, but how about doing a Seder?" Mm-hmm. And I said, "Okay." And we ended up going to the pastor who had been the chair of our delegation in Chicago, the Democratic National Convention delegation, and asking whether we could hold the Seder in his church on the first anniversary of Dr. King's death, which was the third night of Passover in 1969.
What a great
and he said, "Sure."
Confluence, yeah.
Yeah. So there were about 800 people jammed into that hall. Half of them were Jews, and the other half were half white and half black Christians. And WBAI in New York City broadcast the whole thing live, and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation broadcast excerpts of it the next Sunday. And suddenly it became clear, and the response to the Ramparts magazine publishing too, became clear there were thousands of mostly, but not entirely, young Jews who were hungry for such a thing. I've thought of it since as, it's like dropping a crystal into a supersaturated solution, and the crystal suddenly turns the whole solution into the crystal. So it wasn't just me. I mean, if there hadn't been that supersaturated solution, nothing would have happened.
Right. And then a few years later, we had the Jewish catalogs, which initiated a whole phase of do-it-yourself Judaism.
Right.
And we had the growth of Chavurot.
Right. And feminist Judaism. So there was a feminist Haggadah that somebody wrote about a year and a half later.
Right. We got a vegetarian Haggadah.
Yes, that's right.
We got many kinds of Haggadot, and they continue to proliferate.